The arena was electric. Thousands of fans packed into their seats, lights flashing, music pounding, and cameras sweeping across the crowd. This wasn't just another MMA night. It was the kind of event where egos were loud, energy was wild, and everyone was hungry for a moment that would go viral. Near the front row, sitting calmly and almost unnoticed, was Steven Seagal. No flashy entrance. No spotlight. Just quiet presence. Dressed simply, hands resting on his knees, eyes focused on the cage. Inside that cage stood a young MMA fighter, confident, explosive, and full of swagger. He had just won his fight, and the adrenaline was clearly still pumping through his veins. As the referee raised his hand, the fighter grabbed the microphone, smiling arrogantly as the crowd cheered. At first, it sounded like standard trash talk. But then his eyes drifted toward the front row. Toward Steven Seagal. He laughed. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing. "Isn't that Steven Seagal sitting over there?" The crowd reacted instantly. Cheers, whistles, laughter. Cameras zoomed in. The fighter smirked. "Man, I grew up watching your movies, but let's be real," he said. "That stuff's fake. Movies don't make you a real fighter." The arena buzzed. Some people laughed. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Steven Seagal didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just sat there, calm and still, as if the noise didn't exist. And that's what made the moment strange. This is usually how disrespect starts, not with anger, but with ego. When someone feels powerful in the moment, they forget that experience doesn't need to shout. The loudest voice often belongs to the person trying to prove something. Back in the cage, the fighter wasn't done. "Come on," he continued, pacing. "If you're really the martial arts legend everyone talks about, why not step in here with someone real?" The crowd erupted again. Phones were up everywhere now. Social media clips were already being recorded. Still, no reaction from Seagal. Security staff glanced nervously between the cage and the front row. Commentators paused, unsure whether to laugh it off or acknowledge the tension forming in the air. And that's when people started to realize something. This wasn't just trash talk anymore. This was a challenge. Public, loud, and intentional. No one knew how Steven Seagal would respond, or if he would respond at all. But one thing was certain. Whatever happened next was about to shock the entire arena. The fighter didn't stop. In fact, the silence from Steven Seagal seemed to fuel him even more. Still breathing heavily from the fight, sweat dripping down his face, the young MMA star paced inside the cage like a predator who thought his target was weak. He pointed again toward the front row, making sure every camera caught it. "Look at him," he laughed. "Sitting there like some kind of monk." The crowd laughed along, but this time it wasn't as loud. Something about the moment felt off. "You know," the fighter continued, "people talk about discipline, ancient martial arts, all that movie stuff." He shrugged. "But this is real fighting. This is MMA. Not Hollywood." The commentators exchanged glances. One of them tried to shift the focus back to the fight, but it was too late. The moment had already taken a life of its own. Steven Seagal remained completely still. His posture didn't change. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, just calm observation. When someone mocks another person publicly, what they're really doing is seeking validation. Ego feeds on attention. And silence. Silence is frustrating to someone who wants a reaction. The fighter leaned closer to the cage fence, voice rising. "People like you," he said, "made money pretending. Guys like me actually bleed for this." A few cheers echoed from the upper seats, but now there were boos too. Fans were split. Some enjoyed the drama. Others felt the line had already been crossed. Steven Seagal slowly crossed his arms. Still no words. And that's when the fighter made it personal. "Come on, old man," he sneered. "You wouldn't last 10 seconds in here." The arena buzzed. You could feel the shift, the laughter fading, replaced by tension. Phones were everywhere now. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. This clip was already on its way to going viral. Be honest. Do you think this fighter is confident, or just disrespectful? And tell me in the comments, which country or city are you watching this from? Security staff stepped closer to the cage. Not because Seagal had moved, but because the fighter wouldn't stop talking. Steven Seagal finally adjusted in his seat, slowly lifting his head. The cameras zoomed in instantly. The crowd leaned forward, expecting an explosion. But it didn't come. Instead, Seagal's eyes were calm, focused, almost curious. There's a difference between someone who wants to win a moment and someone who's lived a lifetime. Experience doesn't rush. It waits. Inside the cage, the fighter mistook calm for weakness. "That's what I thought," he said, smirking. No response. Some fans booed now, loudly. Others shouted, "Show respect." The fighter waved them off. "Relax. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." But the truth was clear. Not everyone was thinking it anymore. Steven Seagal hadn't defended himself, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't tried to prove anything. And somehow, that made his presence feel heavier than the fighter's words. Do you think ignoring disrespect is a sign of strength or weakness? Drop your opinion below. I really want to know what you think. The tension in the arena kept building. The fighter stood there, breathing hard, waiting for a reaction that still hadn't come. And that's when people began to realize something important. Steven Seagal wasn't avoiding the moment. He was choosing when to enter it. And when he finally did, nothing would be the same. The fighter stood in the center of the cage, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on the front row. The cheers had faded into something quieter now. Anticipation. This was no longer entertainment. It felt personal. Steven Seagal still hadn't said a word. And that silence. It was starting to get under the fighter's skin. He paced back and forth, shaking his head, laughing to himself like he'd already won something invisible. Then he grabbed the microphone again. "You know what bothers me," he said. "Everyone keeps calling you a legend." He pointed toward Seagal again. "A legend of what? Movies? Scripts? Stunt doubles?" A wave of mixed reactions swept the arena. Some people laughed nervously. Others booed loudly. The fighter raised his voice. "If you're really about that life," he said, "why not stand up and prove it?" The camera cut instantly to Steven Seagal. Close up. The entire arena watched his face. Still calm. Still controlled. This is the moment where ego usually wins. When someone is publicly challenged, pride screams for a response. Most people react. Fast, emotional, impulsive. But discipline pauses. The fighter wasn't done. "Come on," he sneered. "Step into the cage. Just once. Let's see if all that master talk is real." The crowd gasped. Even the commentators fell silent for a second. This wasn't playful trash talk anymore. This was a direct challenge, broadcast live, with thousands watching in person and millions more about to watch online. Security moved closer. Officials whispered to each other near the cage. Steven Seagal slowly placed his hands on the armrests of his chair. The movement was small, but the reaction was massive. The crowd leaned forward. Phones went up higher. A hush fell over the arena. But instead of standing, Seagal did something unexpected. He stayed seated. True confidence doesn't rush to prove itself. It understands that timing is everything. The fighter scoffed. "Yeah," he laughed. "That's what I thought." But the laugh sounded forced now. Almost defensive. Because something had changed. The crowd wasn't fully on his side anymore. Some fans were shaking their heads. Others were shouting things like, "Show some respect," and "That's not how you act." Pause for a second. Whose side are you on right now? The young fighter who wants to prove himself, or the veteran staying calm? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments. The fighter wiped sweat from his face and leaned against the cage fence. "You know what?" he said. "Maybe you're scared." That word, scared, echoed through the arena. Steven Seagal finally moved again. This time, he stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. The reaction was instant. The arena erupted. Cheers, gasps, shouting, it all blended into one loud roar. Even the fighter's smile faded for a split second. Steven Seagal didn't raise his fists. Didn't rush forward. didn't look angry. He simply stood there, tall and composed, eyes fixed on the cage. There's a kind of presence that doesn't need aggression. When someone has spent decades mastering control, their energy alone can shift a room. The fighter swallowed hard, then tried to laugh it off. "Oh, now he stands up," he joked. "You gonna teach me some movie moves?" But the joke didn't land. The crowd was quiet now, not because they were bored, but because they were waiting. Steven Seagal took one step forward, not toward the cage, but toward the edge of the spotlight. He didn't ask for a microphone. He didn't need one. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and clear. "Young man," he said, "you're very talented." The fighter blinked. He hadn't expected that. "But talent without respect," Seagal continued, "is just noise." The arena went silent. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't a threat, it's truth delivered without anger. The fighter tried to interrupt, but Seagal raised a single finger, not aggressively, just enough to signal wait. "You fight in a cage," Seagal said. "That's sport. And sport has rules. But discipline is what you carry when the cameras are off." The fighter stood still now. No pacing. No smiling. "Do you agree with Steven Seagal here, that discipline matters more than dominance? Yes or no, and why?" The tension was thicker than ever. Officials watched closely. Security stood ready. This wasn't about fighting anymore. This was about identity. About ego versus experience. Steven Seagal paused, looking around the arena, not at the fighter, but at the crowd. "You're strong," he said calmly. "But strength isn't proven by humiliation. It's proven by restraint." The fighter opened his mouth to respond. And that's when everyone realized. The real test was only just beginning. The arena felt different now. Just minutes ago, the crowd had been loud, playful, even amused. But after Steven Seagal's calm words, a strange stillness settled over the seats. It wasn't boredom. It was focus. The fighter stood inside the cage, microphone still in hand, but the confidence that once poured out of him now seemed thinner. His shoulders were tense. His smile didn't come as easily anymore. He cleared his throat. "Look," he said, forcing a laugh, "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." But the crowd didn't respond the way it had before. A few cheers. A few boos. Mostly silence. Steven Seagal remained standing, hands relaxed at his sides, posture upright but not aggressive. He wasn't trying to dominate the moment. He was allowing it to unfold. This is what happens when noise meets composure. Ego thrives on reaction, but when reaction disappears, ego starts to collapse under its own weight. The fighter shifted his stance, bouncing lightly on his feet like he was preparing for another round, not against an opponent, but against the room itself. "You talk about restraint," he said, pointing again, "but this is fighting. This is what we do." Steven Seagal nodded slowly, acknowledging the words without accepting the premise. "And yet," Seagal replied calmly, "you're still talking." That single sentence landed harder than any insult. The commentators reacted immediately. One of them leaned into his mic and said quietly, "That's not what I expected him to say." The fighter frowned. He wasn't used to this. He was used to cheers, hype, adrenaline, not someone calmly redirecting the energy away from him. "What do you notice here? Is the fighter losing control of the moment, or is this still part of his strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments." The fighter tried again, this time louder. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "That you're better than me?" Steven Seagal shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm saying I don't need to be." A ripple of murmurs spread through the arena. That wasn't arrogance. It didn't sound like pride. It sounded settled. People who know who they are don't compete for validation. They don't need to win arguments. They let time and experience speak for them. The fighter looked around, searching for support. Some fans still cheered him on, but many were quiet now, watching closely. Even those who came for chaos seemed to sense they were witnessing something deeper than trash talk. Security staff relaxed slightly, though they stayed alert. Officials near the cage whispered again, but no one intervened. They knew this wasn't escalating physically. It was escalating psychologically. Steven Seagal took a slow breath and spoke again. "You're strong," he said, his voice steady. "You're fast. And you're brave. But strength without humility burns out fast." The fighter opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since grabbing the microphone, he hesitated. Have you ever seen confidence turn into insecurity in real time like this? Type yes if you have, and no if you think the fighter is still in control. The fighter finally lowered the mic slightly. His voice was quieter now. "You don't know me," he said. Steven Seagal nodded again. "That's true," he replied. "And I don't need to." The crowd reacted, not with laughter, not with shouting, but with a deep, collective murmur. The kind that signals respect being earned in real time. Respect doesn't arrive with noise. It settles in slowly, when people recognize authenticity. The fighter glanced toward his corner, where his coaches stood. One of them shook his head subtly, signaling him to stop. But the fighter wasn't ready to let go just yet. "So what?" he asked. "You just came here to lecture me?" Steven Seagal smiled, not mockingly, but kindly. "No," he said. "I came here to watch a fight. You turned it into a lesson. That did it." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Not everyone clapped, but enough did that the energy clearly shifted. The fighter felt it. You could see it in his eyes. He stepped back from the fence. His chest no longer puffed out. His stance softened. The moment was no longer about proving who was tougher. It was about realizing who was wiser. Do you think moments like this change people, or do egos go right back to normal once the cameras are off? Let me know what you think. Steven Seagal didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, then sat back down in his seat. And strangely enough, that quiet action spoke louder than everything that came before it. Because now, everyone in the arena understood something important. This wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about control. And the storm hadn't passed yet. It was just getting ready to break. Steven Seagal sat quietly for a moment after returning to his seat. The arena was still buzzing, but the tone had changed. The chaos had softened into curiosity. People weren't shouting anymore. They were listening. Inside the cage, the fighter stood motionless. His chest still rose and fell from the fight, but the fire in his eyes had shifted. This wasn't adrenaline now. This was something closer to uncertainty. He lifted the microphone again, slower this time. "So that's it," he asked. "You talk about respect, then sit down like nothing happened?" Steven Seagal looked up. He didn't answer right away. He let the question hang in the air, heavy, unanswered. Silence, when used intentionally, forces the other person to confront themselves. It removes the distraction of noise and exposes what's really driving the conflict. Finally, Seagal stood once more. Not dramatically. Not rushed. Just enough to signal that this moment mattered. "I didn't come here to compete with you," he said calmly. "And I didn't come here to embarrass you." The fighter tilted his head, confused. "Then why respond at all?" he asked. "Because," Seagal replied, "someone has to remind you that strength isn't measured by who you can provoke." The crowd reacted, a mix of applause and quiet murmurs. Even the commentators leaned forward now, fully invested. At this point, the power dynamic had completely flipped. The fighter still had the cage. Still had the mic. But Steven Seagal had the room. The fighter frowned. "You think you're teaching me something?" Seagal nodded once. "I think life already is," he said. That line landed hard. You could feel it ripple through the arena. Do you believe moments like this can actually teach someone, or do people only change when they lose something? Drop your opinion in the comments. The fighter took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "I fight for respect," he said. "I fight to be seen." Steven Seagal listened carefully, then responded. "And that's exactly why you don't have it yet." The crowd gasped, not because the words were cruel, but because they were honest. Truth doesn't need volume. When it's calm and precise, it cuts deeper than shouting ever could. Seagal continued, his voice steady. "Respect doesn't come from humiliating someone older than you. Or louder than you. or quieter than you. He paused. It comes from how you treat people when you think you're untouchable. The fighter lowered the microphone slightly. His shoulders relaxed. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't posturing. He was listening. Be real for a second. Have you ever realized too late that your ego was running the show? Type yes if you have. The arena was silent now. Not awkward. Intentional. Steven Seagal took a breath and added one final thought. You won your fight tonight, he said. Congratulations. But winning fights doesn't make you a master. The fighter looked up. What does? Seagal met his eyes. Mastering yourself. That was it. No insults. No challenge. No dramatic exit. Just a sentence that felt heavier than the cage itself. This was the moment the crowd stopped seeing a movie star and started seeing a teacher. Not because of titles, but because of restraint. The fighter nodded slowly. He didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, he raised the mic one last time. I might have crossed a line, he admitted. The crowd reacted instantly. Applause broke out across the arena. Not thunderous, but sincere. Do you respect the fighter more now for admitting this, or do you think it doesn't erase what he did earlier? Let me know your honest thoughts. Steven Seagal gave a small nod in return. No smile. No victory pose. Just acknowledgement. He sat back down. The moment was over, but its impact wasn't. Because everyone in that arena understood something now. This wasn't about age versus youth. Or movies versus MMA. It was about ego meeting wisdom, and realizing which one lasts longer. And as the fighter handed the microphone back to the referee, one thing was clear. The arena had chosen its side. And the final shock was still yet to come. The moment the fighter handed the microphone back to the referee, something shifted, not just in the cage, but across the entire arena. It wasn't loud at first. It started as a ripple. A low murmur moving through thousands of people at once. Then the applause began. Not wild. Not chaotic. But deep, steady, and intentional. Steven Seagal remained seated, his posture relaxed, hands resting calmly in his lap. He didn't acknowledge the clapping. He didn't stand up or wave. In fact, he barely reacted at all, and somehow, that made the moment even more powerful. Inside the cage, the fighter stood quietly, staring out into the crowd. The same people who had laughed with him earlier were now applauding someone else. Not because Steven Seagal had won, but because something real had just happened in front of them. Crowds don't change sides easily. When they do, it's usually because they've witnessed authenticity. You can't fake composure under pressure. It either shows up, or it doesn't. The commentators finally found their voices again. Well, one of them said slowly, that might be the most unexpected moment we've ever seen in this arena. Another added, this stopped being about fighting a long time ago. Cameras zoomed in on the fighter's face. The confidence was still there, but it had matured in real time. His jaw was tight, eyes thoughtful. This wasn't humiliation. It was realization. Do you think moments like this actually change a person, or do people just adapt until the spotlight moves away? Comment your honest opinion below. The referee stepped forward, trying to regain control of the event. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the applause that returned again, louder this time. This time, it wasn't for the fighter. It was for Steven Seagal. Steven didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked distant, like someone who had already moved past the moment while everyone else was still catching up. People who've spent their lives proving themselves stop chasing validation. When recognition comes, they accept it quietly, because they no longer need it. Security personnel relaxed completely now. Officials nodded to one another. Whatever they had feared earlier was gone. The tension had dissolved into respect. The fighter took a deep breath and bowed his head slightly, not dramatically, just enough for those close enough to notice. It wasn't an apology. It was acknowledgement. The crowd noticed too. Another wave of applause followed. Does this moment make you respect the fighter more, or do you think he should have known better from the start? Tell me what you think. Steven Seagal finally looked up, briefly scanning the arena. Thousands of eyes were locked on him now. For a split second, it felt like he might say something else. But he didn't. Instead, he stood, slowly, and gave a small nod toward the cage. Not to the fighter specifically, but to the moment itself. That nod sent the arena into a full eruption. People stood. People cheered. People filmed. This wasn't about celebrity. It was about witnessing self-control in a world addicted to reaction. In an age where people respond instantly, restraint feels rare, almost shocking. That's why it stands out so powerfully. The fighter watched from inside the cage as Steven Seagal turned and began walking up the aisle. No entourage. No security bubble. Just calm steps through a standing crowd. Fans reached out, some to shake his hand, others just to touch his shoulder as he passed. He acknowledged none of it directly, but he didn't pull away either. Behind him, the commentators summed it up best. That, one of them said, is what experience looks like. If you were in that arena, who would you be applauding, and why? Drop your answer below. The fighter remained in the cage long after Steven Seagal disappeared into the tunnel. The lights dimmed slightly as production prepared to move on. But no one had really moved on. Because they all knew, they just witnessed something they didn't expect. Not a knockout. Not a rivalry. But a lesson delivered without force. And as clips of the moment began uploading online, spreading across platforms at lightning speed, one thing became clear. This wasn't going viral because it was dramatic. It was going viral because it was real. The fighter finally exited the cage, quieter than before, walking past fans who now looked at him differently, not with mockery, but curiosity. The arena lights brightened again. The show continued. But the impact of that exchange, that lingered. Because the loudest shock of the night wasn't a punch. It was the silence that followed wisdom. By the next morning, the moment was everywhere. Clips from the arena flooded social media, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels. Millions of views in hours. Headlines didn't talk about the fight. They talked about the silence. About composure. About a cocky challenge that turned into an unexpected lesson. One caption read, "Steven Seagal didn't raise his voice, and still won the entire arena." Another said, "This is what real confidence looks like." Steven Seagal didn't post anything. No victory message. No explanation. No response at all. And that silence, once again, spoke louder than words. In a world obsessed with reaction, the most powerful move is knowing when not to respond. When you don't chase the narrative, people come looking for you. The MMA fighter, on the other hand, woke up to a different reality. His name was trending, not for his win, but for his behavior. Some comments were harsh. Others were surprisingly supportive. One fan wrote, "He messed up, but at least he listened." Another said, "That moment probably taught him more than any fight ever could." The fighter eventually posted a short message. "I let the moment get to me. Respect to those who've walked the path longer than I have. No excuses. No deflection. Just acknowledgement. Do you think it takes strength to admit you were wrong publicly, or does it depend on the situation? Tell me what you think." Sports analysts weighed in too. Some praised Steven Seagal's restraint. Others debated whether the fighter had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed at all. But most agreed on one thing. This wasn't about MMA versus movies. It was about maturity versus ego. Ego wants the spotlight. Wisdom doesn't need it. That's why wisdom feels rare, and ego feels everywhere. Fans started sharing their own stories in the comments. Times they'd reacted too fast. Moments they wished they'd stayed calm. Situations where silence would have saved them dignity. The story became bigger than the arena. Has there ever been a moment in your life where staying calm changed the outcome? If you're comfortable, share it below. Steven Seagal eventually addressed the moment during a quiet interview weeks later. No drama. No headlines. Just a simple sentence that spread almost as fast as the original clip. He said, "Everyone wants to win. Few people want to learn." That was it. Some lessons don't arrive as punishment. They arrive as mirrors, showing us who we are when we think no one can challenge us. The fighter continued his career. He still fought. Still won. Still lost sometimes. But fans noticed something different. Less trash talk. More focus. More restraint. Whether the change was permanent or not didn't matter as much as the moment itself. Because for a brief time, millions of people watched ego pause, and humility step forward. Do you believe moments like this actually change people long-term, or do old habits always return? Yes or no, and why? The arena eventually hosted many more fights. Louder crowds. Bigger knockouts. Wilder moments. But for those who were there that night, and for those who watched it later, one thing stayed clear. The most shocking moment wasn't physical. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even planned. It was restraint. Strength isn't always about dominance. Sometimes, it's about knowing you don't need to prove anything at all. And that's why this moment lasted longer than any highlight reel. Because punches fade. Noise fades. But lessons, when delivered calmly, stay. If you believe real strength is staying calm under pressure, type respect in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where ego meets wisdom, don't forget to subscribe. More powerful moments like this are coming.